In many calculations in chemistry today, we take for granted some values as constant, unchanging in our modern times. For example, in many reactions we write the pressure of the atmosphere as 1 atmosphere, or ATM. We also assume an abundance of oxygen gas, O2, and some other diatomic gases when looking at combustion reactions. We live on a planet, definitely not unique on the grand scale of the cosmos, but unique when compared to anything we have encountered in our small amount of experience. When we look at the world around us, the Earth is teeming with living things, photosynthetic life and non-photosynthetic life alike. We understand the process by which the complexity of life occurred through evolution and natural selection over billions of years. From the first simple bacteria, mutation in DNA and variation in the environment affected which organisms survived and which ones died off. We know that this process is responsible for every species on Earth today, from us humans to the grass beneath our feet. This reminds us of an important question, however, asked by scientists in a wide array of fields and studies.
The origin of life is something we don't know anything about, and we want to know something about it, and I would love to know how life actually got started, the origin of the first self-replicating entity.
I'm not a biologist, and that's my top 3 things as well.
How did a world of non-living atoms and molecules 4 billion years ago come together to form the first living cells? Cells able to survive, reproduce, and populate our world. The honest answer to that question is that we just don't know yet. Some would even say that the question is beyond the realm of science to answer. But that would be disingenuous, because science uses empirical data, evidence, logical reasoning, and experimentation to come to its conclusions. Undoubtedly, using the tools and methods of science, we can come to a closer approximation to the truth about this question. One thing we know is that all life operates because of organic molecules, or long chains of carbon, hydrogen, and functional groups that make up the structure of living cells and allow the processes in our body to occur. With this knowledge, we know that these organic molecules must have been vital to the origin of life on Earth. Before we go into some of the theories of the origin of life, we must first take a trip back in time to the conditions on Earth about 4 billion years ago, the conditions before life first sprang up on our world. The atmosphere probably consisted mostly of gas from violent volcanic eruptions, and gas and other materials from meteorites the Earth was bombarded with in its formation. The early atmosphere consisted of water vapor, carbon dioxide, carbon monoxide, hydrogen gas, nitrogen gas, ammonia, and methane, but no oxygen gas, something absolutely vital to our survival today. With this in mind, we know that early bacterial life had to have been photosynthetic, or requiring energy from the sun, water and nutrients from its environment, and carbon dioxide from the atmosphere to survive and reproduce. So we now know, using radiometric dating techniques, ancient preserved minerals, and geology, that the conditions on Earth about 4 billion years ago were very different from what they are today. But how could life have arisen out of these conditions? How could such complexity in life arise out of non-living atoms and molecules? This question brings us to an experiment done in 1953 by Stanley Miller and Harold Urey. In their experiment, they put a series of gases into containers to simulate early conditions on Earth and passed an electric current through these gases. 5 years later, in 1958, the 2 experimenters did their experiment once again, but added another ingredient to the mix, hydrogen sulfide, a gas spewed out by volcanoes to better simulate the primordial conditions on Earth in its early years. This experiment was undoubtedly interesting, as these experimenters tried to mimic the conditions in which early life was formed. The interesting thing is that Miller and Urey never examined the products formed in their experiments. About 50 years later, After Miller's death in 2007, Jeffrey Bada, Miller's former student, inherited the samples of the 50-year-old experiment. Through modern scientific techniques, we discovered that the experiment with the hydrogen sulfide gas had formed 23 amino acids. An amino acid is an organic molecule with a carbon atom attached to a carboxyl group, an amino group, and a side chain, labeled as R. Amino acids are vital for life, and they are also the core building blocks of proteins. On top of that, 4 amines were also formed, another type of organic molecule. The Urey-Miller experiment helps us to understand how quickly these important organic molecules can form, with the correct conditions and materials. With an unfathomable amount of time, perhaps millions of years, it is not unlikely that with more and more of these reactions, a rising complexity of organic molecules, and some amount of chance, perhaps the first living cells could have formed. With this, based on the evidence and the knowledge of the conditions on early Earth, there are a few different ideas about how life first began. One idea is that deep-sea vents shot out enough energy and heat deep beneath the sea, where there was enough materials and nutrients for these reactions to occur, and for life eventually to form. Another is that lightning storms gave the sufficient amounts of energy for these reactions, lightning being more similar to the electricity in the Urey-Miller experiment. Another idea is that systems of clay with rich amounts of organic molecules would be able to organize the organic molecules in certain ways in order to facilitate life. We do not know for sure which one of these ideas may be true, and the answer may be all of them to some extent, or maybe even none of them. What we do know is that life on Earth began about 4 billion years ago. The system that created the first bacteria would have needed an input of energy to create reactions, and that it probably took a very long time. For all we know, this process could have happened on Mars and was brought to the Earth by a meteorite that traveled from Mars to Earth. With all this information, we do know a small amount, but the specifics about how the first bacterial cell was formed is still a mystery to mankind. We don't know what happened, but what we do know is that the best way to figure it out is to use empirical and scientific evidence to come to the best approximation to the truth. What's important is that we come to the answer to our problems using the evidence we find, rather than twisting the evidence to fit what we already believe is the answer. Yes, we do not know, and that is important to recognize. But one of the greatest things about science is that there will always be more problems for us to solve. Future organic and biological chemists can continue working on the answer to this question, and through experimentation and new